They set a trap for us and we fell for it. But even then, we made them pay dearly. I can still remember seeing Admiral Ozawa's carriers burning on the horizon. Thick black smoke rose into the October sky like a funeral signal for the Imperial Japanese Navy. 4 carriers destroyed in one day. Hundreds of enemy planes lost. Thousands of their sailors sank into the cold waters of the Pacific. They had lured us north, pulling Admiral Halsey's entire Third Fleet away from the main fight at Leyte Gulf. Their sacrifice nearly succeeded. It almost allowed their battleships to reach and destroy our invasion fleet. But as I watched the last Japanese carrier sink beneath the waves, I realized we had witnessed something historic. The fall of Japan's naval air power, the end of their ability to fight across the Pacific. My name is Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison. I flew Hellcats from the USS Essex during what later became known as the Battle off Cape Engano. But to understand why we were chasing Japanese carriers north of the Philippines on October 25, 1944, you need to know about the greatest deception in the Pacific War. 3 days earlier, I was in the ready room aboard the Essex with my squadron, going over intelligence reports. The Japanese were making their biggest move since Midway. They called it Operation Shogo, meaning Victory Operation. 4 separate Japanese fleets were converging on Leyte Gulf, where General MacArthur's troops were fighting to establish a beachhead in the Philippines. "Listen up, gentlemen," said Commander Jim McCampbell, our air group leader, pointing to a map spread across the table. "The Japs are throwing in everything they've got left. Admiral Kurita is coming through the San Bernardino Strait with his largest battleships, Yamato, Musashi, the works. Admiral Nishimura is bringing another group up through the Surigao Strait. And there's a third under Admiral Shima, also heading for Surigao." I raised my hand. "What about their carriers, sir? Where are they?" McCampbell's face darkened. "That's the big question, Morrison. Intelligence believes they're somewhere northeast of us. Our reconnaissance planes have spotted them, but they don't appear to have many aircraft aboard. That should have been our first warning. The carriers we had been tracking, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, were almost empty. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had managed to gather only about 116 planes for his entire fleet. Most of his pilots were young and inexperienced, nothing like the veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. But we didn't know all that at the time. We didn't know Ozawa's carriers were sailing openly to be found. We didn't know they were sending out radio signals on purpose to attract our attention. And we didn't know that Admiral Ozawa had volunteered for what was basically a suicide mission, to draw Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf, leaving our invasion forces exposed to Kurita's battleships. The Japanese plan was dangerously clever. While we chased Ozawa's nearly empty carriers north, Kurita would slip through the San Bernardino Strait and crush our invasion fleet like wolves among sheep. The Yamato and her sister ships would turn Leyte Gulf into a graveyard. And it almost happened. On the morning of October 24th, the sky was gray and heavy. I was up early checking my plane before takeoff. My Hellcat, tail number 19, sat on the deck of the Essex, fueled and armed for a long-range scouting mission. The talk among the crew was that Admiral Halsey was growing restless. Task Force 38 had been striking Japanese land bases all day, but there was still no sign of their carriers. At 6:30 a.m., I launched with the first search group, 8 Hellcats flying in a wide fan pattern, each covering a 60-degree arc out to 300 miles. The sea below us stretched endlessly, gray, green, and empty. 2 hours later, my radio came alive. "Contact! Contact! Large enemy force bearing 015 degrees, distance 150 miles. It was Lieutenant Bob Cosgrove from another sector. "I see 4 carriers, 6 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Repeat, 4 enemy carriers northeast of our position." My heart started pounding. This was it, the main Japanese carrier force. I turned toward Bob's position and pushed my throttle forward. Within minutes I saw them too. Gray ships cutting through the dark sea, white wakes trailing behind them as they moved quickly southeast. "Morrison to base," I radioed back to Essex, confirming large enemy carrier force. "They're heading straight for us." From my cockpit I couldn't see that their decks were nearly empty. I didn't know Ozawa had deliberately placed his fleet where we could find it. The bait was set, and we were about to take it. Back on the Essex, Admiral Halsey faced the decision that would define the battle. Later, I learned he had received reports about Admiral Kurita's massive battleships moving toward the San Bernardino Strait. Our pilots had attacked them all day, scoring hits on the giant Musashi. Intelligence suggested Kurita was retreating, but Ozawa's carriers, the real prize, were still within reach. Halsey had hunted Japanese carriers since the start of the war. Now he had the chance to destroy what remained of their fleet once and for all. At 8:20 p.m. on October 24th, Admiral Halsey made his choice. The entire Task Force 38 would sail north through the night to attack the Japanese carriers at dawn. No American ships would be left to guard the San Bernardino Strait. The Japanese trap had worked perfectly. That night aboard the Essex, none of us could sleep. We knew we were heading into the biggest carrier battle since the Philippine Sea. In the ready room, we sat close together, sipping coffee and studying photos of the Japanese ships under the dim light of lanterns. "Look at this," said my wingman, Lieutenant Tom Bradley, pointing to one of the photos. "That has to be the Zuikaku. She's the last carrier left from the Pearl Harbor attack." I looked closely at the blurry picture. The large carrier stood out in the middle of the formation, her flight deck dark and empty. "She looks bare without planes," I said. "Maybe they're keeping them below for tomorrow," Tom guessed. "Saving them for one final attack." We were so focused on the carriers that we missed the real meaning of what we saw. Those empty decks didn't hide any planes. They were almost empty because Japan had already lost most of its naval aircraft in earlier land-based attacks. Admiral Ozawa was sailing north with fewer than 120 planes, while we had over 1,000. But even if we had known that, it wouldn't have mattered. We wanted to destroy those carriers. Every pilot in Task Force 38 dreamed of sinking a Japanese flat top. They had started the war, and we were going to end it. As the Essex raced north through the night at full speed, I tried to get some rest, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those enemy carriers waiting for us in the dawn. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up and went out to the flight deck for some air. The sight was incredible. Our entire task force, 17 fast carriers with their escorts, stretched across the sea, the most powerful fleet ever assembled. The Essex, Lexington, Enterprise, Franklin, all names already famous across the Pacific. Their decks were full of aircraft, Hellcats, Dauntless bombers, Avenger torpedo planes, more than 1,000 of them, all ready for launch at sunrise. I wondered what Admiral Ozawa was thinking as he approached us. Did he know he was outnumbered 10-1? Did he understand that this would probably be his final battle? Or did he believe that his sacrifice would help Admiral Kurita's battleships complete their mission? As it turned out, Ozawa knew exactly what he was doing. Aboard his flagship Zuikaku, he had spent the night preparing for what he knew would be the destruction of his fleet. He had volunteered to act as bait, to lure us away from Leyte Gulf no matter the cost. And as dawn approached on October 25, 1944, his plan was working. To the south, Admiral Kurita's battleships were already coming through the San Bernardino Strait, heading straight for the unprotected American landing forces. The first light of day spread slowly across the Philippine Sea, turning the sky from black to gray to pale gold. I was already strapped into my Hellcat on the Essex's flight deck, ready for the first strike. Around me, other pilots made their final checks, testing controls, loading ammunition, tuning radios. At 6:30 a.m. the signal came and I pushed my throttle forward. My Hellcat raced down the deck and lifted into the cool morning sky, followed by 17 more fighters. Behind us, bombers and torpedo planes launched one after another, their engines roaring in the dawn. We were part of the first attack wave. 180 aircraft from task groups 38.3 and 38.4 heading north toward the Japanese fleet. I had never seen anything like it. Planes stretched in every direction, their wings flashing in the early sunlight as we climbed to 12,000 feet. "Morrison, this is Strike Leader," came Commander David McCampbell's voice over the radio. "Target bearing 010 degrees, distance 120 miles. Maintain radio silence from here." I acknowledged and settled in for the long flight. The sea below turned from gray to deep blue as the sun rose. Clouds drifted beneath us, giving perfect cover for our approach. I couldn't help but think about the enemy pilots. Were they scared? Did they know how badly they were outnumbered? Or were they ready to die for their emperor, just as so many of their comrades had done before? At 7:50 a.m., our scouts spotted the Japanese fleet. Multiple carriers, cruisers, and destroyers bearing 015 degrees, 20 miles out, came the calm report. "No enemy air cover visible."
That should have been another warning. Where were their fighters? Why weren't any Zeros taking off to defend them? But none of us questioned it. We were focused on the attack. As we neared the enemy fleet, the view was both stunning and eerie. 4 Japanese carriers moved in a diamond-shaped formation, surrounded by their escorts. The largest, Zuikaku, was in the center, her long deck visible even from high above. The lighter carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho guarded her flanks, while cruisers and destroyers formed a protective ring. But something felt strange. Their decks were nearly empty. Only a few planes were visible, and none were preparing to launch. It was as if they were waiting to be destroyed. "This is Strike Leader," McCampbell's voice came over the radio. "All groups, begin attack. Repeat, commence attack." What happened next was unlike anything I had ever imagined. Instead of a fierce dogfight filled with Japanese fighters, we faced almost no resistance. The few enemy planes that took off, maybe 30 in total, were quickly shot down by our fighters. I stayed high, covering the torpedo bombers attacking Chitose. From 15,000 feet, I watched the chaos unfold below. The first group of dive bombers screamed down toward Zuikaku, their 1,000-pound bombs raining fire and steel. I saw at least 3 direct hits, explosions tearing through her deck and sending thick smoke billowing skyward. Yet somehow, the big carrier kept moving, her crew fighting desperately to control the flames. At the same time, the Avenger torpedo planes were attacking the smaller Japanese carriers. Chitose was the first to suffer heavy damage. 2 torpedoes hit her left side almost at the same moment, lifting her bow out of the water. She quickly started leaning to one side with thick black smoke pouring from her engines. I muttered into my oxygen mask as I watched the small carrier begin to sink by the back. Her crew was already jumping overboard, tiny figures falling into the oil-covered sea as their ship slowly disappeared beneath them. But that was only the start. Admiral Halsey had sent nearly 300 aircraft for this strike, and even more were on their way from other task groups. The Japanese were about to feel the full power of American naval air strength. Around 8:20 a.m., the next wave, called Strike Baker, arrived. 200 more planes from other carrier groups joined the attack. I watched as they broke into formation. Dive bombers heading high for the carriers and torpedo planes sweeping low over the water. The sky was filled with the roar of engines and the flash of explosions. Chiyoda was the next carrier to be destroyed. Dive bombers from the Intrepid dropped their bombs right in the middle of the ship, hitting the section where fuel for aircraft was stored. The result was a massive explosion, a bright orange and white fireball that lit up the sky and tore the ship apart. Within minutes, Chiyoda rolled over and sank, taking most of her crew with her. From above, I could see Admiral Ozawa's fleet beginning to fall apart. The surviving carriers were turning sharply in circles, trying to dodge the never-ending attacks. Their escort ships fired wildly at the sky, filling it with dark bursts of anti-aircraft fire. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't stop the steady stream of American bombers coming for them. The heavy cruiser, Tama, was hit by a torpedo in the middle and started leaning heavily to one side. The destroyer, Akitsuki, took a direct bomb hit and disappeared instantly, leaving only wreckage and a spreading patch of oil on the surface. Yet through all this, Zuikaku kept fighting. Her captain was a skilled veteran, steering and maneuvering through the chaos to avoid bombs and torpedoes. She had survived Pearl Harbor, fought at the Coral Sea, the Eastern Solomons, and the Philippine Sea. She was the last of Japan's great carriers still afloat, and she refused to die easily. By 10:30 a.m., we had been attacking for nearly 3 hours. I was low on fuel and ammo, but I couldn't look away. This was history, the final destruction of Japan's carrier fleet. Chitose and Chiyoda were already gone. Zuiho was burning fiercely, her crew fighting desperately to save her. And Zuikaku, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was still moving at full speed despite being hit at least a dozen times. But Admiral Halsey wasn't done. Another wave, Strike Charlie, was coming, with 200 more aircraft sent to finish off the remaining Japanese ships. As I saw them approaching from the south, I knew this would end it. The final attack on Zuikaku was brutal and precise. Dive bombers from 3 carriers attacked one after another, their bombs striking her deck from front to back. Each explosion sent flames and debris flying high, but still the carrier kept moving. Then came the torpedo planes. I watched as a squadron of Avengers from Essex flew straight in, ignoring the heavy fire from enemy escorts. The first torpedo hit Zuikaku near the bridge, the explosion lifting her deck like paper. The second struck the center, and the third hit near the back. That finished her. The carrier slowed, stopped, and began leaning to one side. The same flight deck that had launched planes against Pearl Harbor was now a burning wreck. Her elevators were blown out, and the hangar below was a roaring fire. At 2:30 p.m., the last of the Pearl Harbor raiders slipped beneath the waves, her rising sun flag still flying as she went down. Nearly 900 men went with her, many of them veterans who had been aboard since the start of the war. An hour later, Zuiho followed her to the bottom, breaking in half as explosions ripped through her hull. In less than 8 hours, we had sunk 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and destroyed most of their escorts. It was one of the most one-sided naval battles in history. Admiral Ozawa's once powerful fleet was gone. But as we began to celebrate, grim reports arrived from the south. Admiral Kurita's battleships had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait without opposition and were closing in on Leyte Gulf. The Japanese decoy plan had worked exactly as intended. As I flew back toward the Essex that afternoon, my fuel almost gone, I couldn't help but feel torn. We had wiped out Japan's last working carriers in one day and ended their naval air power for good. The battle off Cape Engano would be remembered as one of America's greatest victories. But we had also been deceived. While we were busy destroying Ozawa's bait fleet, Kurita's battleships had nearly reached our vulnerable invasion forces. Only the desperate bravery of a small group of escort carriers and destroyers, who called themselves Taffy 3, had stopped what could have been one of the worst disasters of the war. Those men stood their ground against an overwhelming enemy force, buying enough time to save thousands of lives. Later, I found out that Admiral Kurita had been just minutes away from reaching the vulnerable transport area when, for reasons no one could ever truly explain, he turned his ships around. Some said he believed he was heading straight into Admiral Halsey's powerful main fleet, rather than a few lightly armed escort carriers. Others thought that perhaps he lost his nerve at the most crucial moment. We'll never know the truth, but what we do know is that the Japanese plan almost worked. Their decision to sacrifice 4 carriers and thousands of their finest sailors had nearly brought them victory. If not for the unbelievable courage and quick thinking of the men of Taffy 3, Leyte Gulf could have turned into a graveyard for MacArthur's entire invasion force instead of the final resting place for Admiral Ozawa's carriers. As the Essex appeared on the horizon ahead of me, its deck already crowded with returning aircraft, I tried to understand the scale of what had happened that day. In just a few hours, the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy had been effectively wiped out as a major fighting force. They would never again be able to launch a coordinated carrier strike. They would never again threaten American control of the Pacific skies. The age of Japanese naval dominance was over. Yet, even as we celebrated, the victory came with a heavy cost. Admiral Ozawa had knowingly led his men into a hopeless battle, sacrificing his entire command in a final attempt to save his nation's hopes. 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 2 cruisers, and 3 destroyers were gone. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors lost their lives that day, including many who had served since the earliest days of the war. But perhaps the greatest loss for Japan was the death of its last 116 trained carrier pilots, men who had taken years to train and whose skills could never be replaced in wartime. With their deaths, Japan's ability to fight in the air from the sea ended forever. It wasn't until after the war that I came to understand the full story behind Admiral Ozawa's actions. Captured Japanese documents revealed the real purpose of Operation Shogo. When I read them, I couldn't help but feel a deep, quiet respect for Ozawa. He had understood something that few commanders could accept. His carriers, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, were now little more than hollow symbols. Most of his planes had been lost in the previous battles of the Philippine Sea, and his remaining pilots were young and inexperienced. They were no match for our battle-hardened American aviators. Still, Ozawa understood one thing perfectly: the psychological pull of aircraft carriers on Admiral Halsey. He knew that if his fleet appeared close enough to be discovered, Halsey would take the bait. So he made his fleet visible, broadcasting radio signals and placing himself where our search planes could easily find him. Ozawa knew what he was doing. He was leading his men to their deaths, but he did it willingly, believing that by drawing Halsey's forces away, he could open a path for Kurita's battleships to reach and destroy MacArthur's invasion fleet. His plan was daring, almost suicidal, yet brilliantly conceived, and for a time it nearly succeeded. In his final report before the battle, Ozawa wrote that he was using his few remaining ships and planes as bait, and that his mobile force was prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice for the Emperor and for Japan. It was a simple, powerful farewell, the kind of message only a man who fully understood his fate could write. It was both tragic and noble, a reflection of how far the Japanese would go for their country. 50 years have passed since that October morning when we sent the last of Japan's carriers to the bottom off Cape Engano. I am an old man now, and most of the men who fought beside me are gone, but I can still see it all as if it were yesterday. The fiery explosions, the dark smoke rising from the burning ships, and the ocean swallowing what remained of the once proud Japanese fleet. I can still see the mighty Zuikaku rolling over to die, the same carrier that had launched planes against Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. The sea was calm that day, almost peaceful, but beneath that calm was the end of an era. For almost 3 years, Japanese carriers had ruled the Pacific. Their planes had struck fear across thousands of miles, from the beaches of Pearl Harbor to the harbors of India. Their pilots were once the best in the world, skilled, fearless, and deadly. Their ships were advanced and powerful, unmatched in design and discipline. But by late 1944 their time had ended. America's industrial strength had become unstoppable. We were building carriers faster than they could even design them. We were training pilots faster than they could replace their dead. The balance of power had shifted completely. Numbers, resources, and production had become the new weapons of victory, and Japan simply could not keep up. The war had turned from a contest of skill to one of endurance, and we had the strength to endure. Even in defeat, though, the Japanese showed something remarkable. Their courage and devotion, even in the face of certain death, left an impression that time could not erase. Admiral Ozawa had known his mission was hopeless, but he carried it out anyway because he believed it was his duty to his emperor, his people, and his nation's honor. His sailors went to their deaths without hesitation, convinced that their sacrifice might protect Japan for just a little longer. They fought until their ships sank beneath them, their flags still flying. War has no glory. Despite what the movies might show, victory never feels sweet. It tastes of smoke, salt, and the knowledge that countless good men have died. Some friends, some enemies, all human. But sometimes war becomes necessary, and when it does, the price must be paid, no matter how terrible it is. The battle off Cape Engano was one of those moments. By destroying Ozawa's fleet, we secured control of the Pacific once and for all. The road to Tokyo Bay lay open before us, marked by the wreckage of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They had set the bait, and we had taken it. But in the end, it made no difference. We had the ships, the planes, and the men to finish the fight. No trick or deception could stop the tide that was already turning. The only remaining question was how long it would take, and how many more would have to die before Japan's rising sun finally fell for good. As I watched those last carriers slide beneath the waves, I knew I was witnessing the closing of a great circle, one that had begun with fire and betrayal at Pearl Harbor. After 3 long years of struggle, the score had finally been settled. The sea was calm again, but beneath its surface lay the wreckage of an empire, and the memories of a generation that had fought to the very end.